Well, again, welcome to the 27 October 2017 edition of Portsmouth This Week. Our guest today is Leigh Reposa, and the topic we're going to talk about today is the youth suicide prevention programs. Leigh is a licensed independent clinical social worker, and she's been with the Rhode Island Youth Suicide Prevention Program since the fall of 2009. She serves as the chairperson for the State Rhode Island Suicide Prevention Advisory Committee and is an active member of the Rhode Island Medical Examiner's Office Child Death Review Team. She also is an adoptee and an adoption advocate and has a postgraduate certificate in adoption and foster care from Rhode Island College. Leigh is also the 2014 recipient of the National Association of Social Workers Rhode Island Chapter Robert S. Burgess Community Service Award. Welcome to the program, Leigh, and I just wanted to, I thought your background is quite interesting, and I just wanted people to know some of your credentials going forward. I guess to begin with, can you talk a little bit about your own background and then eventually how you got involved in this kind of program?
Yeah, I think that my own background, and oftentimes people say, you know, how did you get involved in working with youth suicide prevention? I just tell them that it's something that chose me. I didn't necessarily choose it. It's a vocation, and I think that things just kind of naturally happen the way that they should. And it was kind of a calling to work with youth and specifically with teaching people in the community about how they can recognize warning signs and risk factors in young people that they might work with, either in a school setting or in a community-based setting, and how to get that child connected with help earlier rather than later to kind of really shape their outcome in a more positive way if possible. So my background is I started in politics. I actually worked for John Chafee years ago, who was Secretary of the Navy, as you know. Sure. And during that time, we had actually passed the adoption bill at that point, and just knew that I wanted to work in some level of, you know, advocacy with certain populations, whether it be children in child welfare or in education. And then once I left Washington, I moved back to Rhode Island, and this opportunity presented itself after I finished graduate school. So it's been a wonderful fit for, and I have a passion for, you know, really educating.
Well, I think this is a topic that I think deserves passion. You know, it's a very important topic. What about, are you a Rhode Island resident? And,
yes, I live in Narragansett, Rhode Island. I live with my puppy, Jack, who's 2 years old.
What kind of dog?
He is a black lab mix, okay, which means that he has a lot of energy.
Yeah. I have a Siberian Husky
okay.
pup, so I know about energy.
And you know, I'm glad that you mentioned that, you know, where I live, but also, you know, the connection with animals, I think, is also something that I incorporate into my work in schools and, you know, with education, and the power of, you know, kind of the unconditional love that animals can provide and can be considered a protective factor for youth and for young adults.
I've seen that at Newport Hospital as well. You know, they do a great job.
Yes, there's a golden retriever that actually is a, I don't know if, through pet therapy, people do volunteer work, so yes.
It's a great dog, though. I love that dog. Tell us a little bit about Rhode Island's suicide prevention program, and kind of, you have a very impressive website, or they do, you do.
Thank you.
I guess, how did this get started, and what does it do in the state?
That's a good question. So in 2005, Garrett Lee Smith actually died by suicide. He was 19 and he was in college, and his father was a member of Congress at the time, and ultimately passed the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act, which allows states to access or to apply for grant monies to do prevention work in their state. It's also part of a Native American grant as well. So Rhode Island actually was one of the grantees. We had applied through the Rhode Island Department of Health and were granted the first cohort, and we're now in our third cohort of funding to do prevention work in schools. And now we actually work very closely with providers on an emergency basis through the Bradley Access Center, something called KidsLink. So there's definitely a history, you know, about 20 years at this point of, you know, evidence-based trainings that we incorporate in the work that we're doing in schools and in the community. And then, so I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Does your funding come primarily from the federal government?
It comes
or-
from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is SAMHSA, and that money is actually...
That's a federal...
That is a federal agency, and that is where the Rhode Island Department of Health, so SAMHSA is the main funder through the Department of Health, and then we, Rhode Island Student Assistance, is a contractor on that grant.
Okay. Now, do you get anything at all from the state of Rhode Island? I know our own prevention coalition here in Portsmouth has difficulty getting funding.
This
to
is
keep
separate
up with their
funding
programs.
that's specific for the suicide prevention work.
Yeah, well, this is, you know, when I read through this, I went on your website, looked around, as I say, and I got a little bit educated, and it seems to me there's a very definite fit between what you all do up there for suicide prevention and what they do here
Yes.
for drug and alcohol abuse
Yes.
and things like that. When I went online and looked at these statistics, it blew my mind, and then when you just told me another one, 4,000 kids a year die by suicide. That's kids between 15 and 24. You were telling me that 22 veterans a day die by suicide?
They do, yes.
I mean, this has truly become a national, like an epidemic or something. And
So suicide is the second leading cause of death for our young people.
wow, that's
Yes.
kind of a depressing statistic on its own. At what age do you start seeing people become at risk for this?
So believe it or not, actually, young children actually experience suicidality or suicidal ideation. A lot of times these are children who have been exposed to, even in utero and beyond, violence, trauma. These are also children that oftentimes have been neglected. They might be, you know, a victim of abuse. So it can actually start as early as 4 or 5.
4 or 5 years old?
Yes. So if you think about, so you've worked in the military. You have a couple different ways that we survive in the world. So we have fight, flight, and freeze. So inherently, that's what people are doing. So these might be little kiddos that are experiencing a lot, and their brains are saying flight.
Yeah, big time.
And then what we see is that if, you know, they're not getting any kind of intervention for that trauma exposure, it can escalate in our middle school or high school, and they might start doing things that, like self-harm, cutting, or some type
Yeah,
of
see,
behavior.
once kids get in the school system, there are other kids around and teachers that can observe this stuff.
Exactly.
But I can
which is
see,
great.
particularly for young kids, they could be really at risk, especially in an abusive, you know, family situation.
Yes.
Another statistic that kind of leapt out at me was that boys, men, die by suicide 7 times more than women.
And use more lethal means, yes.
Have we figured out the reason for this, or do you have a good answer? Is there a...
I work specifically with the young youth population, so it's about 5 to 1. Girls attempt more often than their boy peers, and boys complete more often. And in Rhode Island, so there is actually, you know, some positives. We have a very low completion rate in Rhode Island of youth suicides. We have an extremely high attempt rate. So when you were talking about earlier, you know, different you know, ways that we connect in the world, the more we have a child connected, the more protective factors that they experience. So connectedness, if you think about Rhode Island, there's about 1 million or so people here. We maybe have 1 or 2 degrees of separation versus other parts of the country. So, and we also have a number of different emergency or trauma. You know, we have a trauma 1 level at Hasbro, but we also have a number of different urgent cares, crisis centers, even the VA hospital, within a very small radius. So sometimes there's an attempt in process, but it's intervened by getting that person.
You know, one of the things that, for the layman, for the average guy on the street is, well, I think you'd know if somebody in your family, depression and alcohol abuse and drug abuse play a big role in this.
They do. A huge role. It's a huge risk factor. I would say the 2 that I really try to underscore with people is substance use and abuse, and any kind of significant loss or compounded loss. That's what we see when we look back.
Okay, now, substance abuse is, you know, parents probably would know something about that, perhaps, in their kids. You'd like to think so. At what point, though, does somebody take the leap to actually thinking about suicide? How can you tell?
So it's really brain chemistry. So I look at warning signs and risk factors that are surrounding that child, life experiences, behavioral cues. situational cues, and then as far as the thought, so if you have a depressed brain, and let's say you're being treated with an antidepressant, and you're drinking or drugging, the effect of that medication is null, right? And then if you have a developing brain, so the male biological brain feasibly develops fully in 22 to 24, female brain 24 to 26. So if you're thinking about a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, their executive functioning, that frontal lobe is still developing. That's impulse control, that's decision making. So if they're drinking or drugging and they already have a depressed brain and they don't have that impulse control, that's when we're at crisis.
Yeah, and the Prevention Coalition here at Portsmouth has been talking about the importance of young kids, like you say, teenagers, doing drugs and alcohol. It messes up their brains.
It can exacerbate something that's already existing, or untreated, or maybe not even diagnosed at that point. But the important thing to really underscore is that the social norm around drinking and drugging for young people is 20%. 20%. So 80% are not drinking and drugging. 20% might be. So I think that it's just important to frame that into a positive.
Yeah.
That sometimes young people will say, "Well, everyone is doing such and such,"
I think everybody says that.
And that's not true.
Yeah, they'd like to think that, perhaps. In your statistics, do you see, as people mature, do you see this level of suicide dropping off after 25, say, or does it continue? And
we still have attempt rates and completion rates even after adolescence. Yes.
Okay, so even if the brain kicks in, they still may have done enough damage that...
It's really not damage, it's whether or not that person's being treated for things like a diagnosis of a mental health issue like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, or so it's really about making sure that person is in treatment and connected to treatment throughout the different lifespan.
Okay, so for a family,
it doesn't go away. Depression doesn't go away. Just like if someone's diagnosed with cancer or cardiac,
sure.
It doesn't go away. So it's treatment, just like anything else.
Yeah, and it seems like this is one of the things that families can and should be a big help in supporting the person that's going through this stuff.
Yeah, and I think what happens is that, we're all human, and families, if they don't have the experience or the education or the comfort level, they might be less likely to be engaged with their child or someone in their family that is going through this. So it's really about these types of conversations and continuing them, and just talking about things that our kids are already talking about, and using the word suicide, using the word, are you going to kill yourself? We used to say things like, are you going to hurt yourself? And I think that made the provider feel more comfortable about introducing a serious topic, but it wasn't helpful at all. So now we're very intentional and concrete about the words that we use.
Yeah. Now, do you do programs in high schools?
Yes, we have evidence-based programs, teach in 7th grade, 9th grade, and 10th grade. So we use something called SOS, Signs of Suicide, which is an evidence-based peer-to-peer training or curriculum classroom. So I've done a number of them throughout the history of the grant, and it's really rewarding. It's a wonderful, kids already know before the adults do oftentimes whether or not there's something off with a peer or a sibling. Yeah. So what we're teaching them is to act, how to acknowledge if a friend is struggling, how to show care and concern, and then what trusted adults we're going to tell. So ACT, act. Okay, now,
getting back for a second to the male versus female dichotomy here, with many times more men or young men committing suicide than young women, what is the reason for that? Is it a physical, is it hormones? What is it? Why would men, like you say, they use perhaps more effective ways of killing themselves?
I would just say
is that?
Anecdotally, so in Rhode Island, it's really, it's not as, it's such a low number that we can't really look at the trend for that.
Sure.
But I would say that just anecdotally, young women might be more likely to talk and feel comfortable about, talking with friends or their family, and kind of getting their needs met just by verbalizing how they're feeling, versus maybe traditionally young men are raised, or boys are raised to maybe not express their feelings about what they might be feeling emotionally.
Yeah, good point.
So they might stuff those feelings, and then all of a sudden we're at crisis.
So what can we do? What can all of us do to prevent this? I mean, to be able to intervene when you need to.
I just say if you feel something is off with somebody in your life, say something. Even if you're not going to introduce the thought of suicide into someone's mind just by saying, I feel like you're going through a lot right now. Are you thinking about killing yourself? You have a history of attempts. You have a history of depression. You're just going to open up a conversation.
So just by saying that, you're actually
giving lowering
them the idea.
Correct. That was a huge myth.
I think that's an important point.
That's a huge myth. Huge myth. Yes.
Yeah.
You are actually saying you have the courage to talk about something really serious and that you've recognized that there's something different about that person.
Okay, well, give us a couple of the symptoms,
So we touched on any kind of use or abuse of drugs and alcohol, absolutely. Any kind of loss or significant loss that's happened in someone's life recently or over time.
A death or something of a
or it could be a loss of a health status. It could be loss of housing. It could be loss of lots of different types of loss, as you can imagine. Family incarceration, deployment, deportation, any kind of loss, pet loss. And then also we're looking at changes in, if somebody has a change in their appetite, their eating, their sleeping, they're not able to sleep anymore, or they can't fall asleep and stay asleep. All of a sudden they don't have an appetite and they're restricting, and you notice there's weight loss, and maybe there's just basic things like hygiene that have changed for that individual. So when you're depressed, major depression, very difficult to get out of bed, never mind do basic things like showering and brushing your teeth. So these are things to definitely not only notice, but to start to explore why these things are happening and make sure that that person's connected.
Yeah, I would think, talking to your teenager anyway, if they're moping around or something, talking to them about depression, for example.
And especially, so if there's history of depression in someone's family, that's something that, the pediatrician hopefully, is aware of, or...
Okay, so there is a physiological...
Yes, it's a chemical
background to this.
imbalance,
Okay.
yes. So depression is something that happens in the brain.
Yeah, so it's not their fault, is
No,
what you want to say, I guess.
no. Neurotransmitters, they're just this chemical in the brain, and they need to be talking to each other. So that's what I say to kids. These neurotransmitters need to be connecting, and if they're not, that's when there's the depression. All the medication does is gets them to connect. Very simple.
Yeah. It's a tough problem, I think, for parents, especially with you don't know what the kids are doing on social media. Social media is another interesting thing, though, because that's another... If you see somebody's acting very depressed on Facebook or something, maybe it's time to think about talking to them one-on-one,
Absolutely. And supervision, both virtually and in person, is critical for parents.
See, a lot of times I think parents don't understand what kids go through every day. I know I wouldn't.
Right. They don't.
And
it's not their fault. It's just their child might be having a very different life experience than they did when they were an adolescent. And like you said, we have a lot more things now that we didn't have 20, 30 years ago.
Exactly. So you guys do essentially a lot of training things with the schools.
Yes, teachers. So
teachers as well.
Frontline support staff. So at the school level, school social workers, psychologists, student assistance counselors. There might be guidance staff that are trained, the wellness staff or the nurses.
Now then, do those counselors and the folks that you do train, do they go back to the schools and talk about it to other teachers?
They're actually, we train them first, and then we train the faculty, the teachers, and then we train the students.
Yeah.
So there's 3 different layers, and
so the students actually get a talk about this generically. I'll tell you another one is coaches. I think you have to bring coaches in because they see a lot that the teachers don't see.
The front office staff in schools as well, and the cafeteria folks, and the janitorial staff, the coaches, anybody that works with youth after school, maybe it's in the theater department, the music department, all very critical people to have trained.
Now, I guess but it really comes back, so much depends on the parents. And I know it's always difficult getting parents engaged in what their kids doing in schools and things like that. It's a tough job, but I think this suicide issue brings all that to the fore. This is, if you needed a reason to get involved with and try to understand what your kid's going through, this is it.
It is.
Because yes, it's serious. It's not just you're having a bad day, your boyfriend's mad at you, blah blah.
Right.
it could get serious.
Yeah, and usually what we say is have a low threshold. So if you already suspect that your child's been under a lot of stress lately. So one of the other myths is that suicides happen more often around the holiday season. That is a myth. They actually go down during that period of time. We're more connected socially and with our families. They spike in the spring, and then especially with our young people. They have compounded stressors that they're experiencing. It could be academic stress, social stress, it could be athletic stress, and then peer stress, and then there's also going to be a transition where they're going to be leaving school for this, going into the summer. So springtime is the time where this is kind of our busy season. Not to make light of that, but it isn't. So it's really important that we end up training a lot of people before the spring to recognize these types of changes that children could experience.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for kids, and it's difficult to know and I think you could probably see it if you're a parent and you're watching, is that transition from just kind of moping around to something more serious, and as you say,
isolation, withdrawing.
Now the thing is, if you do talk about this, if you can get your teenager to talk to you about this, then what? I mean, then what do you do? How do you help them out of it?
So there's two pieces to what you just said. I would say, first of all, don't wait until your child is in middle school or high school to start talking about emotions and depression. And I mean, you start very little, even children's books. So you start as young as possible, so that way they grow up.
So they understand that it's not something that's unique to them.
They grow up knowing that this is just something they might experience and that it's okay to talk about. And then you revisit it when obviously you see any kind of changes. But for parents, there's a resource called KidsLink, which is part of Bradley Hospital. You do not need to have a medical insurance in order to access this resource. It's called KidsLink, and the number is 1-855-KID, K-I-D, LINK, L-I-N-K, and that goes automatically to the Bradley Hospital Access Center, which is in Rhode Island. And parents can call it if they feel like their child is either experiencing emotional distress or crisis, or if they just need to sort of say, I'm seeing this, what do you think? And then maybe they might go from there and actually, so there's a master's level clinician that's answering the calls.
Okay, so there is professional help.
There's a clinician answering the calls, yes. And they might say, you know what, it would benefit to contact your pediatrician, maybe bring the child in for an assessment or an evaluation. Maybe that child just is already connected to a counselor and they need to go more often. Maybe there's some things in school we can do to accommodate, and help the child cope. Or in some cases, they might need emergency services, or they might need to go to an inpatient program or a partial program or an outpatient program.
Yeah, I would think bullying would have an impact on
bullying
this area.
is a risk factor for suicide, is a form of violence, interpersonal violence. So any kind of violence is obviously trauma, so that's a risk factor. A lot of times children are experiencing, they might even be an aggressor versus just a victim or a victim, and it's another stressor that the child is experiencing. So any kind of trauma or violence. Unfortunately,
life is stressful.
Life is stressful.
And that's something.
So coping skills are huge. So
absolutely.
The first part of the trainings that I do, I talk about self-care, and I put up a couple pictures of my dog, and I talk about how self-care is really important, and that we're modeling self-care with our kids. So getting enough sleep, hydrating, mindfulness, just taking a deep breath sometimes, going for a walk. Maybe some people have things like they like to cook, they have crafts, they have hobbies, they play golf, whatever it is. But we want to make sure that our kids have self-care and coping skills.
Yeah.
Because then all of a sudden they have all this stress, but they need to have a
way to get out of it.
Or a way to cope with it.
Right,
They're not going to necessarily get out of it because that's life, like you said, but we want them to have that toolbox of coping skills.
See, a lot of times I would think that parents also have issues like this.
Absolutely.
Particularly with just making a living today and owning a house or renting a house and keeping things up. It's got to be stressful.
It is. Relationship stress, family stress.
If you tend to be depressed to begin with, that makes it tough, and it also would make it tough, I think, on your kid, because they see how depressed you are.
Right.
And they're thinking.
And if you're getting help and you have,
if you're getting help,
and if
that'd
you're
be a
in
positive
treatment,
thing.
That's also something that your child sees. My mom is getting help for depression. She takes an antidepressant and it helps her. So if they know that, then it's pretty transparent that that's okay for that child to get help as well.
See, I would think that a parent would be a little cautious about, like you say, intervene early or start talking early if you can. I would think they'd be kind of cautious about making that leap, that this is really serious. You know, a fight with your boyfriend or something, right? Stuff like that. You can tell the kid all you want that, yeah, it's painful, you'll get over it. But when you're going through it, they don't necessarily
Right.
understand that. Yeah, I don't think I'd want to start talking about suicidal tendencies yet, or even thinking like that, unless there's some other kind of trigger or something else that happens. Typically, are there sort of, when you look back at these cases, are there things that should have or could have stuck out, and you know, in these kids' lives that somebody might have picked up on? And
It's usually things that I talked about before where there were maybe, so it's really important that everyone in the child's life is connecting and having conversations about what they're seeing or experiencing. And what happens is that we notice that there might be a piece where the child was experiencing something, but everyone else didn't know that. So we only have a little bit of information versus all of the information. So there might have been a child who was going home to a very unhealthy, traumatic household, but the school might not have known that. And it would have been maybe helpful for the school to have known the types of stressors that that child was under.
but you can't call up and say, we're having fights at home, so just to let you
You can.
know.
You actually can. You can. We actually want we want parents to share what might
Now,
be
who
going
would they
on.
call into, like the
The
school
school
counselor?
social worker or the student assistance counselor, or and maybe even a teacher, whoever they have whoever they feel comfortable with. It could be an administrator. So a lot of times parents will call the school principal and say, you know, my partner and I are going through some rough stuff. We're potentially, you know, going to be divorcing or something, and they give a heads up.
Divorce has got to be another big player.
It is. It's a loss. Yes.
Yeah.
They give a heads up that, you know, their child's going to be experiencing some.
We only got about a minute left. I could talk about this with you all day because it's fascinating. It's depressing, but it's fascinating. How can people support your organization?
Honestly, they can do things, not necessarily for our organization, but I think supporting organizations like American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They can contribute to the Rhode Island chapter. They can participate in events that we have, awareness events and walks that we have in the community. And really, honestly, it's just having a conversation with somebody in their life. Maybe from this program, somebody will notice that there's a difference. So just supporting the fact that this is okay to talk about. And to not perpetuate stigma.
Quick last question here. Do you have a need for volunteers?
We don't, but we know that our partners in the community do, like American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I'm sure the Rhode Island Samaritans.
Yeah, and the Portsmouth Prevention Coalition needs help too.
Always.
Leigh, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been fascinating, and I wish you luck on your project. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for being a part of the prevention conversation.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time on Portsmouth This Week.
How do you use plastic bags? How do you get rid of them? Do you carry your groceries in reusable bags? We'd like to know what you think. Please fill out the Town Plastic Bag Survey online at surveymonkey.com/r/Portsmouth Plastic Bags, or fill out a hard copy at the library, Clements Market, or at Town Hall. A link and more plastic bag information is also available at the town website, portsmouthri.com. If you would like to discuss the use of plastic bags, please plan to attend the Town Plastic Bag Workshop on Thursday, November 9th at 7 p.m. at the Town Hall.